me know in chat now, when you're thinking about feedback, if you were in sort of one sentence to describe feedback, like what is feedback, where would you start? Have a go. Let me know either in a word or in a sentence, keeping it quite short. Where do we go when we think feedback? Caroline has gone improvement, a gift from Andrew, love it, helpful, an honest reaction, a reflection. It can be scary, anxious, constructive, a data point, dread there, good to be honest. I think we've all had quite different probably experiences with feedback, and that can definitely influence how we feel about feedback. That's really lovely, Brittany, love that. Revealing blind spots to help us grow, can be a bit confusing, way to get alignment. Okay, and then 3 potential definitions for you here. Data for our development, insight that helps improve, and perspective that increases our self-awareness. Let's use our stars and let me know which of those 3 definitions appeals to you the most. So for our stars, if you're here for the first time, you're looking for view, options, annotate, stamp, and then star. Which of those 3 definitions appeals to you the most? And if you'd like us to put a star on for you, if you're on your phone, it doesn't work, unfortunately. You can always do that, but as long as you're answering the question for yourself, that's the main thing. So data for our development, insight that helps us improve, perspectives that increase our self-awareness. I'll give everybody a second just to find those stars and have some fun. At the moment, insight that helps us improve, I don't know, that and perspective that increases our self-awareness, those 2. Less love for data for our development. It's so interesting. I ask this question in loads of organisations all across the world, and we get really different responses. Some organisations love data for our development. Some organisations I get 0 stars. I think there's something about the word data that either really appeals or actually also really puts people off. But it's interesting. Insight and okay. Yeah, I actually quite like data for our development, but I can see why it definitely isn't universally appealing. That's what I've found with that description. We use that sentence quite a lot when we're doing our workshops. We'll say, oh, this is useful data for your development. So I really like it as a way of describing sometimes what we're trying to do, but as a maybe single definition, it can be a bit polarizing. So I'm just going to get rid of those stars for a second. I'm interested to know in your organizations, though I appreciate for some of you, it might be your organization or you might be freelance, but how many of you feel like you have, let's do it there, a shared understanding and definition of feedback in your organization? So if I went to 5 people in your organization and said, so what do you think feedback is? I get very similar answers, maybe not exactly the same, but very similar answers. Or do you think actually I'd get a very mixed response? So some people saying maybe I don't know, some people giving very different points of views. Or do you think, no, actually, I feel like broadly a sample of 5 people, or the 5 people in our organisation, if you're smaller like us, would all say something similar? Yeah, that's interesting. Kat and Karina, they're good observations around data. Is data more objective? Can feedback be more subjective? Also depends what we're feeding back on. Yeah, Tanya, you get a very mixed response. We mainly find we get a very, very mixed response. I've actually not come across very many organisations, so I'd talk to you if you think this is true in your company, where people do have a shared understanding, where, let's say, as an example, as part of your induction, so when you first join an organisation talks to you about, well, this is what we mean by feedback. This is our kind of, the how we do things around here. This is culturally how we view feedback. So if I was looking for this to be really embedded in an organisation, where would I expect to see it? I would expect to see it when you start, so whatever kind of onboarding or getting started you have in your organisation, I would expect to see it in career conversations. I would expect to see it in one-to-ones, and I'd also expect to see it consistently. if we're thinking about a shared understanding. Oh, brilliant, Kat. You're using challenge and build. Yeah, we talk about challenge and build to just increase the comfort level of being happy with giving and receiving feedback. For people who haven't come across challenge and build before, it's almost a framework for thinking about, like, why would we give feedback? Oh, it's like you're almost inviting someone to challenge and build. And we sort of invite each other to challenge and build all the time in a very sort of constructive, hopefully, and positive way. Yeah, lovely. I like that. I think as you start an organization, it's a really brilliant opportunity, particularly if you're trying to do something different, to have this understanding, even to have it in teams. Often you see in 2 different teams, feedback will mean something really different, and it can be quite reliant on who you work for. I've been in some very big organizations where feedback has felt very different from team to team, from department to department, which again, if at a strategic level, organization is saying to me, well, feedback's really important, it's how we learn, it's how we grow, this is always my starting point. Have you got a shared understanding? Where does it show up in the moments that matter? And often that's a miss. People can't describe to me across all of those different moments that matter how feedback shows up. So let's clear that for a second. So let me know now when you're thinking about fast. I don't know why I did a sound effect there, just came out. Fast and frequent. Give yourself a score 0 to 5 using the scale that you can see. How fast feedback is at the moment. So how quickly do you give and get feedback, and how frequent is it out of 10? So maybe when you do it, it's really fast, but actually it's very ad hoc. So your frequency score might be lower, or maybe you give and get feedback quite frequently, but you think it's sort of too slow, or maybe your scores are exactly the same. Love that from Kat as well, just sharing, starting a meeting with, this is a challenge and build session. We want your feedback. Yeah, I've actually done that before. I was once working on a project for Sainsbury's about food waste, which actually was very, very interesting. And I really remember a specific meeting where I was sort of presenting this project and actually openly saying to everybody, this is challenge. I actually called it challenge, build and kill, because in that retail environment, that worked quite well to actually give people the permission to kill it if it wasn't the right thing to do. And if anything, it made the idea even stronger. So sometimes actually challenge and build is a really good way to influence and persuade. Lovely. Getting positive feedback on team calls, great. Even better if not so much, people who don't know the EBIs. Yeah, thanks, Kat. Yeah, FMCG, I suspect that would also go down quite well. Great. So we've got a real range of scores here. We have got some 7+, but not many. Most of us sort of kind of below that 5 mark. So I was really thinking about this after recording the podcast. And I think there's 2 things for us to think about if we are trying to increase the frequency and the pace. So how fast and how frequent our feedback is. There's how we do it. So what are the tools, the techniques, the frameworks, kind of the ways of delivering, of asking for, of giving and getting feedback that can help us to be fast and frequent, which is really what we talked about in the podcast. But the more I've thought about this, the more I've thought, I wonder if that's the easy bit. So I will talk about the how in a second. I'll just reinforce some of those ideas for action. But in lots of ways, I think it's that skill of kind of the quick give and get is not that hard to come up with ideas. I wonder if the bigger unlocker, and this is sort of my hypothesis, is the when. So when we identify when kind of the fast and frequent feedback is going to happen, when we understand and when we know, and when it's sort of built into our weeks, I wonder if that will then help us to make sure it just becomes part of how we do things around here. So I've decided that the when is more challenging. And I was trying to think about, what have we done with whens that have worked really well when you're trying to change behavior? Because fundamentally here, we're trying to change behavior. Changing behavior is always hard. It's always easier if we attach it to something that already happens. So just as a couple of examples on things other than feedback, and then I'm going to talk about feedback. I always find using an if-then framework really helps me with when, because you're basically creating what's sometimes described as a heuristic, a short in your brain that says, if this happens, then I'm going to do that. and it makes it easier for us. So in our team, for example, one of the things that we've worked really hard on is if we make a mistake, then we have something called mistake moments. And that's not something that we don't talk about those. There's no meetings, there's no phone calls. That's purely done on Teams, on Microsoft Teams, where I make a mistake and I always magnify mistakes in my mind. I'm definitely someone who can spiral, I can overthink. But what we really want to do with mistakes is learn from them. We want to be a high trust team where everyone makes mistakes, because everyone makes mistakes in every team, but we want to be a team where you can learn from those mistakes individually and together. So how do you create a when and if then? And so what we do is we go into teams sort of within 24 hours and just really quickly share mistake moment. This is what happened. This is what I learned. And then we sort of usually either, let's say I've done it. Lucy, Sarah, Helen and our team might go, they support me. They say, can I help? Don't worry, I've been there. And then we kind of move on, but we've all kind of learned together from that mistake. So we've sort of created that shortcut. I was thinking about another one, very specific to Sainsbury's when I started to think about feedback. We used to have a meeting in Sainsbury's called the trading board, which is about as fun as it sounds. So it was a serious meeting, quite a lot of people, lots of senior people, probably way too many people in that meeting, kind of in hindsight. But what my director did brilliantly, also called who was on the board, when she took over chairing that trading board, what she was like is, right, if we've got a trading board, then she got to the point where every person who presents will get some feedback that day. And the way that she did that is she shortened the amount of time that people had to present. And she then used the extra time to go around and ask everyone across the room, kind of a what worked well and an even better if question, which she would write down as people were speaking. And then that day you'd get that feedback. So it was something that already happened. And she just slightly adjusted how that meeting ran so that feedback was just part of kind of how we do things in that meeting. And to me, that was a really good example of taking something that's already happening and where there was no feedback, but actually it was something where people deserved feedback because people worked really hard on those presentations and they were scary and they were intimidating. And then suddenly you knew, actually, I'm going to get some really useful feedback. And Sarah always worked really hard to make sure people had a lot of what worked well and maybe one even better if. So she'd probably go for 3 what worked well and 1 even better if, I would say, on average. And people in that room, you could see initially, everyone was like, oh, what is this? This feels unusual. We're not used to doing things this way. And it also showed me in that moment the importance sometimes of someone very senior role modeling behaviours. Because by Sarah doing that, and then you've got lots and lots of directors in that room, lots of very senior people, suddenly someone very visible is saying, I think this is important enough for us to spend time on. And in a big organisation with lots of hierarchy, that's kind of no thing. So I was starting to think, right, okay, so what are some of those moments that matter when it comes to feedback? So we might go, okay, some of the ideas that I came up with were one-to-ones. So if you've got one-to-ones in your organisation, if we've got a one-to-one, then we spend the first 5 minutes or the first 10 minutes on what's working well, even better if, for example, using some of the tools that we talked about. But we might say, we might be even more specific. We might go, if we've got a one-to-one, then we always start it with 1, what's working well, and 1, even better if. It just becomes our default for how we start that conversation. That could work. Probably need to experiment with some different ideas to see kind of what works best. If we've got something that we repeat, so we talked on the podcast about the dangers of autopilot when you repeat things. So if we've got something that is repeatable, let's say, like recently we've been doing recruitment, so recruiting someone, that's quite a repeatable process, then we automatically start a what's working well, even better if wiki, for example. And again, moving away from this idea that feedback always has to be, big formal conversations that are full of fear. And for some organizations, that's definitely how feedback feels. Whereas actually, when you've got a wiki, which is for people who don't use Teams, Just imagine like a little tab, basically, where everybody can go in and add their thoughts. And what I really like about them is it's an ongoing feedback. So rather than having to remember or store things in your mind, you've got a place to put things. So one of the observations I've made about myself at the moment is I'm really good at critical reviews. I'm good at spotting what works well and even better ifs. But the problem is I don't feel like I have anywhere to put them. So I keep them all in my head, and I probably remember, I don't know, let's say 50% of them at best. So one of the things that I've definitely noticed, a gap that we've got in our company, is I need a place to put that feedback. And Helen and I talk about it all the time of when for our first 2 books, we really wish we'd done that, because there's loads of what worked well and even better ifs. And at the time you think, it's so important, I'll remember it. But of course you don't, because in a month's time, something else feels really important. So I think where I would go next with this, kind of building on the podcast from this week, is I would want to map the moments that matter when it comes to feedback, and then think about, what are those thens? What could we try? So for example, Kat's thought on challenge and build. Are there certain meetings that we can identify? Can we start calling meetings challenge and build meetings? Suddenly you've got meetings that are sort of designed to create an environment of giving and getting feedback. Great. Are there certain projects? Are there quarterly team meetings? Are there moments in your week? And also moving away from feeling like this always has to be a conversation. This can be a one-line message. This could be something where we're putting our thoughts all simultaneously at the same time. Yeah, David Height does really like Evernote. So yeah, that's a very similar way of doing it. It's like sort of capturing your insights rather than kind of wasting them. Often I think we kind of waste a lot of our thoughts because we don't have a place for them. Yeah, the getting things done methodology, that's a really good reference. David Allen, I'm going to hope I've got that right. Is it? Yeah, I think that's a good it's a good observation. Does it feel like a permanent sort of pop-up of, or does it feel relentless? Depends on your starting point. I think it could feel relentless if it feels like we are always beating ourselves up. I think it feels useful if it feels like it's designed to help us all improve and get better. So I wouldn't like the idea of thinking, oh, we're always sort of picking holes in things, or nothing's ever good enough. You know, like if you're in a culture where you think that, then I think that feels very different to, oh, well, actually, we've got an ongoing place where we put our what's working well or even better ifs. So I think maybe the when, for people who are kind of really, if you're really interested in this, it's an area I'm really interested in. I think the when has a lot of opportunity, and I definitely don't have all of the answers yet, but I think it's helpful to start thinking about those moments that matter. Just a few things on the how. As I said, I've decided actually this is the slightly easier bit, but we should definitely all just keep practicing these things. These were some of the ideas for action that we talked about in the podcast this week. We talked about this idea that ones win. So this is how we frame our feedback. Framing feedback is so important. If people in your team are saying, oh, can I just have some feedback? Really try and encourage them to frame that feedback. What's the one thing I could do better? What's one idea you've got for how PodPlus could work even better for you? What's one idea you've got for how PodPlus could be even more useful? Give people one. One is easy, it's quick. Most people can see one thing that's working well, and or one even better if. I've used this a lot with things that I'm good at and I want to get even better at. So I really remember saying to my boss, actually, same Sarah, when I was presenting in front of something called our leaders group, what's the one thing that would make my presentations to this group even better? You know, would give me even more kind of credibility and commitment from the people listening to me. And she just gave me really small bits of feedback, but that felt really useful because I felt like I could do something with them, you know, rather than that overload and overwhelm of too many messages at once. So I always like a one question because I think we can do one questions quite quickly. Next one, praise plus. So this is getting into strength spotter territory, which is praise is great. It makes us feel really good, but it isn't useful, other than probably useful to make us feel good. But in terms of, it's very difficult for it to be actionable, is probably a better way of describing it. If you tell me PodPlus is great, I feel great. but I don't change anything. I don't take any action. If you tell me PodPlus is brilliant because I've got something I can do something with. If you tell me that presentation went really well, Sarah, I really appreciated how you told stories to bring that project to life. Like, just add the why to the praise. And it's a really small thing that we can all do for each other that takes 30 seconds. I will always remember being in Paris in a meeting, which sounds glamorous. But do you know what? It was glamorous. I was by far the least glamorous person there, and I was the only person who couldn't speak French. And I remember being very intimidated, and it was with a very glamorous brand. And they had to do the whole meeting in English because of me. So everyone else was like, sounding all glamorous in French. And I was like, I don't know what anyone's saying. And everyone's drinking espresso. And I was like, is there I have never felt more English. And so they switched this whole meeting to English for me. And I was really nervous. And I was presenting all about marketing and brand and corporate responsibility for this brand. And I remember coming out of that meeting, and the guy who was the founder of the company disappeared off in his posh car. And I was like, I need to get home. How do I get home? But he disappeared off. And he sent me literally a 2-line email. And that 2-line email, first of all, went, brilliant job, Sarah. I thought you did really well. But he just added the why. And he just said, your examples and your stories made all the difference today. I could see that's when people really leaned into the conversation. Now, first of all, I'm clearly really needy that I can still remember that. But it's really interesting that just that extra bit of insight, that extra bit of data for my development makes all the difference. I might have thought that presentation was brilliant because I was so clear, or that presentation was brilliant because of my insights or my data points. But he had told me it was my examples and my stories and my enthusiasm, like nothing if not enthusiastic, that's what made the difference. So it really helps us to understand our intent and our impact. Does our intent and our impact, are they working together? Continuing on that theme about being a strength spotter, I think this is something that we can just all do for each other more. We are often our own worst critics, and we all have blind spots, I think, as well, when it comes to our strengths. So if you can do anything to help people see their strengths, it's worth its weight in gold for someone else. It's a really generous and also quite easy thing that you can do. I see you at your best when. It's really valuable when you, you've really used that super skill of ... And this is how it's been really helpful. So just bringing that into the conversations that we have, career conversations, one-to-ones, even just in conversation. Helen's very good at it. She will often, almost just as part of a normal conversation we'll have, she'll say, that's a real Sarah super skill, that ability to create something from nothing, or take that complicated thing and then make it simple. And she'll just sort of weave it into what she says, because she's just used to saying, she's kind of got her default way of saying it. I guess she's created her if then in her brain. And so that's just become part of how she talks to people. So more and more strength spotting helps us to address that negativity bias that we all have in our brains. And we do have a small, I don't know what we've called it, like a small tool that's free on what strength spotting questions sound like. So I will make sure that we can find that for you, and we'll put it in the resources. But all of those things I've said, you'll all be able to develop those questions for yourself. What else did we have? Yes, we've talked a little bit about it already. Just look for anything when you're on autopilot and see if you can move it to auto improvement. Often anything where we've done it a lot before, or we do it quite quickly, we stop getting better, because it's just about getting it done. It's just about getting it out the door. It's actually, when you look at the flow diagram of when we find our flow, it's sometimes because it's almost like a bit too easy and we're a bit bored, so we go into autopilot. I always think it's really interesting to think about, well, how could you add feedback into autopilot so you get to auto improvement? So you just kind of keep that work in progress mindset. So just look out for any of those things that you do. And then the last thing we talked about was quick questions. And what I really liked about this was being specific about timing. So, for example, Helen did this recently. She said, what's one thing I need to keep doing between now and Christmas that's working well? And is there one thing I could do more of or start doing? between now and Christmas that you think would just help us to keep growing our business? And so she sort of phrased it probably slightly differently to that, but she'd time boxed it. So rather than just asking kind of very, very big questions, even though it was only one thing, if she'd have just asked me that generally, it probably would have taken me longer to think about. It took me the longest of everyone in the team anyway. But at least by saying between now and Christmas, she made me think, okay, so it can't be something dramatically different. It's got to be something in the next couple of months. And then it helps her to focus. So it's helpful for her and it's helpful for me as the giver. So you've kind of got the give and the gain there. So I think quick questions, one of the ways to make a question quicker and to get a quicker response, so we get to the fast as well as the frequency, is to time box it in some way. Cool. So I hope that has felt helpful. As we sort of, this second bit is really what we covered in the podcast, and the when bit I think is an opportunity for us all to think about, like, what might this look like? How could we look at our whens to really make feedback just kind of part of how we work? Because otherwise I think it will always just feel like an extra. And I think anything that is extra is really hard in our weeks to remember and is often the first thing to go when we all get busy. So I'm just going to stop sharing now.